I'm here on this cold evening. Obviously, you're all got how shall I say? No. You've got virtual platform amnesia. You're sick of being keyboard warriors, and you want to be real warriors, which is good to see. Because, but for the keyboard warriors, this will be on YouTube. So don't get excited. Look, I want to talk about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, but actually draw inferences to 2024 in Australia, because that's that's the point. That's the point of these talks. We look at the historical background and then we move forward. Now, I'd like to start off with a quote. Hopefully, I'll remember it. George Lovelace came back to London, pardoned, free trip back to London, arrives in London. And these were his words. Arise, men of Britain, and take your stand. Rally round the standards of liberty, or forever lay prostrate under the iron hand of your land and money-mongering taskmasters. Transportation did not have the intended effect on me. But after all, I've returned from my bondage with my views and principles strengthened. It is indelibly fixed in my mind that labour is ill rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over the millions. I believe that nothing will ever be done to relieve the suffering of the working classes unless they take it into their own hands. Direct quote. Think of 2024. Think of 2024 and think of the situation. Yeah. Fuck Karl Marx. We're not interested in Karl Marx. I'm trying to do a presentation. All right. Yeah. Questions later. All right. So, who was George Lovelace? What was all this about? What has Lord Melbourne got to do with it? The man who this city of 5 million people is named after, right? What has he got to do with it? What's it all about? Remember last month we talked about the Swingers and the Swingers' revolt in southern England by agricultural labourers in the 1830s, which led to the transportation of 500 men and 2 women to Australia. Now, what we're seeing is a transition from a traditional form of protest by people who are dispossessed, which what usually used to happen, you'd have a riot, you'd have a reaction, the ringleaders would be hanged or transported. But what we were seeing in the Northern England with the repeal of the Combination Act in 1824, which allowed trade unions to be formed, was the beginning of the trade union movement in the new industrial heartlands of Northern England, which we've spoken about: Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, London. But in the south, the traditional relationships between the landowners, the tenant farmers and the agricultural labourers continued. What happened is that most of southern England, after the swing riots, came to an accommodation with their labourers, agricultural labourers, and the average wage for an agricultural labourer was increased from 6 shillings to 10 shillings a week, and that meant that they were actually able to feed their families. But in Dorchester, which is quite close to London, in Dorchester, James Frampton, and remember that name, I said to you, remember that name from the lecture last month. James Frampton was the magistrate, and he was a major landowner in Dorset, and they entered into major negotiations with Frampton and the other landowners, and the wage in Dorset was increased from 6 shillings to 7 shillings to 8 shillings to 9 shillings, and then they went back on their words and it went from 9 shillings to 8 to 7 and possibly 6. And 6 meant utter degradation and starvation for the labourers on these estates, landed estates, because all they had was their labour to sell. So in 1832, George Lovelace, who was a very religious man, he had joined the Methodist Church, which had been created by the Wesleyan brothers in 1784, not just because of doctrinal differences in religious interpretation, but because the Church of England clergy had been totally integrated into the English ruling classes. They were part of the English ruling classes, they got a tithe from the population, and the Methodist Church arose from that environment. Now the Methodist Church was different, and George Lovelace was a lay preacher. Now they encouraged their members to learn to read, because illiteracy was a major issue at that time. They learned to read in order they could read the Bible, okay? They also had certain disciplines. They were about self-improvement, self-reliance, and about self-denial in many regards. And they were anti-gambling, anti-alcohol, and believed in fidelity in marriage. That was their major issue. So they were organised in comparison to the rest of the ring rioters. Now the swing rioters wanted to go back to the traditional relationship before the land was enclosed. Remember I spoke about the enclosures, 6 million acres over 60 years? They wanted to go back to that traditional master-servant relationship. But George Lovelace realised that things had changed. And at the same time there were major political changes, because in 1830, 32, the Whigs knocked out the Tories. Middle class liberalism became the name of the game. We saw the abolition of slavery. We saw the change in the political system, in the electoral system, which hadn't been changed for the 1690s. So the Whigs were basically a reformist party, but they were a reformist party in terms of middle class liberalism. They really weren't interested in the mass of the workers, because the franchise was not extended to the mass of the workers. This is in Britain at that particular point in time. That's the right to vote, what I'm talking about, the franchise. So George Lovelace was part of a very close-knit community in Tolpuddle, and he realised that the way forward was to form some type of disciplined organisation to resist the landowners. He understood that these riots that used to occur regularly were basically a waste of time, because all it meant is that the leadership groups were dissipated and people would get back, they'd be continued to be repressed. So organisation was the key. So what he did is he made contact with a London group which had been set up by Robert Owen, and those of you who know your history, remember Robert Owen was the utopian socialist who set up the model factories, where workers were recompensed for their effort. And he formed you'll like this, Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. They had big ambitions. They wanted to amalgamate the trade unions in Northern England, but they had no impact in Southern England, where it's based on agriculture and the traditional relationships. So Lovelace made contact with the Grand National Consolidated Trade Unions in London and organised for 2 of their delegates in 1832, because wages had been knocked back down to 7 shillings. They were talking about 6 shillings, which would have meant, in their words, utter degradation and starvation, to come and address the workers at Tolpuddle. 40 people attended that meeting and gave them some ideas on how to form a union and what to do, how to keep notes, how to, membership fees, etc., etc. So on the the old story goes that 6 of them set up the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers as a union in 1832, 1833. But the reality is a bit different. What happened is, on the 9th of December, you've got to remember this date, 9th of December, 1833, a number of members of this new union met at the house of Thomas Stanfield and Diana Stanfield. Now, Thomas Stanfield was George Lovelace's brother-in-law, okay? At the same time at this meeting there was James Lovelace, who was his younger brother. He was 26, father of 2. George Lovelace himself was married to Diana Lovelace, who was the sister of Thomas, and I'm going through all this because it's important, the sister of Thomas Stanfield, and they had 3 children. Thomas Stanfield and Diana Stanfield had 6 children. At the meeting there was also John Stanfield, who was the 21-year-old son of Thomas Stanfield. These 4 were practicing Methodists. 2 of them were lay preachers. So you've got to remember the Methodist Church and the principles of the Methodist Church in terms of self-discipline and self-organisation and self-improvement were central. But at the same time, England at that point in time, it was a very suspicious type of society. It was riddled with spies, because the way the landowners kept control was to have spies in every little village, okay? So on the 9th of December, they swore an oath, 6 of them. And there was also 2 more, a 21-year-old James Bryan and another 22-year-old James, a lot of James in this, James Hammett. They were both from Church of England. None of them had been involved in the swing riots. The only one with a criminal record was James Hammett. He had been jailed for 4 months for pilfering 3 pieces of iron. And what you had is that what people needed to do with these emerging trade unions was to have some type of secrecy to try to keep out spies. So what happened is they had it's almost laughable, but they had a 2-metre high skeleton, a picture of a skeleton. They had a Bible. And if you were a member of the union, you had to take this oath. And the oath, this is not the full oath, but part of the oath said, "I do, by God and this most loyal lodge, solemnly swear to not to work for any master not in the union, and never to divulge any rules unless what is before me plunges my soul into eternity." And you'd kiss the Bible, right? This was a mechanism via which to maintain an anonymity and integrity in the organisation. So the swearing of the oath was relatively common. You had the Orangemen, the White Boys, all these Irish rebels, all of them had oaths. All right? So they swore this oath on the 19th of December 1833. 9th of December 1833, right? You think that's the end of it. Now James Frampton had spies all over Tolpuddle, and he forced one of these spies, Edward Legg. So if you're a descendant of Edward Legg, it's not a good place to be. So Edward, 2 G's, not 1, to actually act as king's evidence, because he was actually at the swearing-in ceremony and took the oath himself, right? So James Frampton, the magistrate, put pressure on him to reveal who was at this particular meeting. Now, has been a major shareholder and magistrate, he was very concerned about the growth of trade unionism in southern England, because that would break down the normal relationship that occurs between the tenant farmer, the labourer, the landowner, nobility. There's this normal relationships, this hierarchy, right? So he, unfortunately for Mr. Frampton, the Combinations Act, which was repealed in 1824, meant that trade unions were not illegal. So he looked at the law and he believed that they could cobble together three different statutes which were not related, which were about illegal oaths, which was quite and I'll explain why this was important. So he contacted Lord Melbourne, who was the Home Secretary, and Lord Melbourne was very concerned about the growth of the trade union movement in Northern England, especially Robert Owen's Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. He was very concerned because he believed that the resolutions, these are the exact words, resolution and acts of unions are designed to control their masters. Now he knew that because he was part of a reformist government, the Whig government in 1832, which had made some major middle class liberal reforms, that it would be impossible to bring back the Combination Act. So he advised James Frampton that they could use these statutes, and I'll go through these statutes because it's important. In 1797, there was a Royal Naval revolt against the war with the French, and the Spithead, the naval forces at Spithead and Nore, blockaded the Thames, right? And they demanded the king abolish Parliament and sue for peace with France. 29 of the ringleaders were hung and 15 were transported to Australia. But the thing is, there was an act which banned people from taking oaths, which they didn't have to take because, of the law, right? Except for the Masonic Lodge, they were excluded. Any other oath was illegal, and the penalty was 7 years transportation. At the same time, there was an act in, I think it was 1799, which again reaffirmed that, but it said that as far as the oath was concerned, that it was just a fine. And in 1840, there was another statute put in, again about illegal oaths. So they cobbled these together. And what happened is, before the matter could be taken to the magistrates' court, because by then the 6 of them had been arrested and were in Dorset jail. That's George Lovelace, his son James Lovelace, Thomas Stanfield, his son John Stanfield, James Bryme and James Hammett. The interesting thing about James Bryme and James Hammett is they actually married into the family later on. All right, but so where was I? Yeah, the oath. So they had to have a court hearing to see whether it was legal to go ahead with the trial. And guess who the legal authorities were on the trial? There was James Frampton, there was his son John, there was his stepbrother, and there was Lord Melbourne's brother-in-law. And obviously they found that the statutes were legal and that these men needed to be tried in the magistrates' court. And the penalty for swearing an illegal oath was 7 years transportation. So here they are, they've been arrested, they're in Dorchester Gaol, they've never done anything wrong in their lives, except for Mr. Hammett, who pilfered 3 pieces of iron. But and they're waiting trial. Eventually the trial starts in March 1834. And guess what? The jury only had tenant farmers on it. There were no Methodists on the jury, there were no agricultural labourers on the jury. Tenant farmers are totally dependent on their landlords in order to survive, because at any time they could have the rug pulled out from under them. So obviously these 6 men were found guilty. and the judge went off his brain. Baron William was the magistrate or the judge. He went off his brain. He said that what these men had done, formed this Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers, is they would stagnate trade. They would ruin their masters, and that's the key, ruin their masters. They would destroy society, and they deserved to be transported to Australia for 7 years. Now the interesting thing was that this became a test case between the government of the day, the Home Secretary Lord Melbourne, and the emerging trade union movement, because the Grand National Consolidated Trade Unions of London actually paid for the legal representation for the Dorchester labourers. So they were concerned that the government was trying to subvert the Combinations Act of the repeal of the Combinations Act of 1824 by bringing in this illegal oath business, right? So what actually happened is that George Lovelace was offered a deal. He was offered a deal. He said if he renounced the union, he could go home. He refused to renounce the union, because if he renounced the union, he would renounce basically his family. He renounced everything that he stood for. So he refused to renounce the union. Now, at the same time, protests were beginning in London. Robert Owen had organised a protest just after the trial. Over 10,000 people turned up. Remember, this is a day you don't have cameras, you don't have microphones, you don't have PAs, but about 10,000 angry people turn up because they see this as an attack on the emerging trade union movement, and that's what it was. This is not just about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, it's about an attack on the whole emerging trade union movement. But they failed to halt the transportation. Now, Thomas Stanfield, John Stanfield, James Lovelace, the three James, James Lovelace, James Bryan and James Hammett, were put on a brig, the Surrey, I think, within a few days have been found guilty, which is unheard of, and they were transported to Sydney. George Lovelace was left in the Dorchester jail for 2 months, and then he was put in the hulks, in irons, and they were hoping that he would die, but he didn't die, so he was put on the William Metcalfe and sent to Hobart. Now, when they arrived in Australia, you've got to remember that the same people who ran agriculture in southern England were the same people who were running agriculture in Australia. Because as I said before, Australia was based on three things: genocide, free land, free labour, and the convicts provided the free labour. You know, the dead Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders provided the free land, and they provided that. That's the way it worked. So these are the same people, the same ideology. These are the sons of the landed gentry who've come to Australia to make a fortune, growing sheep, sending wool to the industrial mills which are emerging in northern England. So it's all interconnected. So when these five arrive in New South Wales, they're treated less than human. And the thing is what's called an assigned system. Now, Thomas Stanfield was particularly hard dealt by. He was sent to a farm in Maitland, and he was forced to live in an open box at night because he was supposedly guarding the sheep. He wasn't allowed inside. And every night he had to walk 6 kilometres in the dark to get his rations. And being the eldest of the men, he was in terrible condition. His son, John, was on another farm in the Hunter region, but he was treated relatively well off. James Lovelace had to walk 300 kilometres to the farm where he went, but again, he was treated reasonably well off. James Bryan, the 21-year-old, ended up on a farm again in the Hunter, and he was treated miserably And James Hammett actually walked to a farm in Queanbeyan, and guess who was the head of the farm in Queanbeyan? Edward Eyre. Remember Edward Eyre? Australian history, Central Australia explorer, protector in inverted commas of Aborigines. But he was very well treated on James Eyre. Now they arrived in August 1834. Poor old George Lovelace arrives in Hobart in October 1834. And guess who is the governor of Tasmania? Have a guess. Come on. A great Arthur. That's right. George Arthur, with his new plans, for the, reformation of these scoundrels. Now, Governor Arthur was a reasonably intelligent man, and he interviewed George Lovelace when he arrived, because he had been told that he should be kept in chains and put on a road gang, which basically meant certain death within a few years. He was to be worked to death. But George Arthur listened to him, and he said, "Why did you do it?" He said, "Well, I didn't know it was illegal to swear an oath." And then he said, "If I didn't do it, my family would be in utter degradation and would starve to death on 6 shillings a week." And he thought, that sounds reasonable. So he put him in the road gang for a week and then put him on his own farm, the governor's farm, to look after the cattle. Now, an interesting thing is, these 6 men who were transported, not one of them received the lash. Because in that year, 3,000 convicts, which is 15% of the convicts which were in Australia at that particular point in time, were whipped. So they were pretty pliant. Although George Lovelace found himself in a difficult situation when 9 of the cattle he was looking after wandered away. And he was brought before a magistrate, and he was able to argue that he was just overwhelmed with the work he had to do. Now, the important thing is, you can check on all this, because 5 of the 6 men wrote their own account of how they were treated and about the process they went through. And you can access that account on the net quite easily. And George Lovelace made some very important observations. He said that those on the state farms were much better treated convicts than those on the private farms. They were half starved, half naked, worked to death. He said Arthur's system was totally ridiculous, that you can't resolve the issues by punishing people in this way. Now, what happened in England? Huge protests. 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people coming together to protest against the sentences, because this is an attack on the emerging trade union movement. So we've moved from a period of mass disruption, which is rioting and arson and machine breaking, to a period of disciplined organisation through a trade union structure. So these were disciplined things. At the same time, it was quite obvious that what had occurred was totally illegal, that there was no legal precedent for this. And some of the conservative media became involved in the case and supported their pardon. We had radical members, remember there were radical members in the Whig government. They came across, especially the Irish nationalists, which were in Parliament, because remember when we spoke about the Irish Nationalist Rebellion, that in order to resolve the issue of having an Irish Parliament and a British Parliament, after 1794, they integrated the 2 parliaments together, and the Irish had a little bit of representation. So, and also, the Home Secretary had changed. Our good friend Lord Melbourne, who we all worship here in Naarm, right? Our good friend became Prime Minister, or was about to become Prime Minister. Earl Grey tea. He was Prime Minister before Lord Melbourne. But a bloke called Lord John Russell, who was sympathetic to to the Martyrs, he became the Home Secretary. And so support was being generated. At one stage, a petition of 250,000 signatures, and this is in an illiterate population, was presented to Parliament, to be presented to the King, King William, to have these men pardoned. So the momentum was growing. The anger was growing, the momentum was growing, and at the same time, let's not forget what's on the mind of these people who've come to Australia, their families and children. Now, James Frampton said to Diana, and this is recorded, Diana Stanfield, mother of 6, her son's been transported, her husband's been transported, her 2 brothers have been transported. He said to her publicly, "You shall suffer want. There will be no mercy for you and your children," which obviously fed into the propaganda against the judgment. At the same time, the emerging trade union movement collected money to support the families, the Stanfields and the Loveless. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when they formed their union, you'll like this, the membership fee was $1 a year and $0.01 a week. And the reason they did that was because they knew that if they went into a strike mode, that they would need some type of collective resources to support people during that strike. But that's just by the way, I forgot that. So getting back, so this pressure is mounting. Eventually, the papers are making fun of the Duke of Cumberland, King William's son, the heir in waiting to the British throne. Because guess what? Him and most of the nobility were swearing illegal oaths because they were patrons of the Orangemen, the Northern Ireland Irishmen. They were patrons. So obviously it became so, and the papers were calling for Lord Cumberland to be jailed to the den of thieves in Sydney, for 7 years. So the pressure was mounting. So, and obviously Lord Russell wanted this to go away. They wanted all this to go away. So on the 14th of March 1836, guess what? The six Tolpuddle Martyrs were pardoned, but more importantly, their fare back to England was to be paid by the British government. This had never happened before in convict history. People were pardoned, but they had to find their own fare back. Unfortunately for Mr. Hammett, James Hammett, who was in with Edward, what was his name? Edward Eyre. Unfortunately for James Hammett, he'd been charged with assault in the interim, and he had a 2-year extension on his sentence. Now, Governor Arthur, being a very stern disciplinarian and a man who knew how to do things, organised for George Lovelace to come back to England. And he arrived back in, I think, July 1837. That's a year later. He arrived back in England. But unfortunately, the New South Wales government under Governor Burke didn't bother to tell the other 5 that they'd been pardoned. So it took, that's right, they didn't bother. So it took, obviously they were dispersed everywhere, they said. So obviously they found out eventually that they'd been pardoned and they got their passage back to England. When they got back to England, 5 of them, remember, poor old James Hammett is still at Queanbeyan, right? Now, he stays there for another 2 years, and then he's got to get, he begged Edward Eyre to give him the money to go back to England, and he eventually went back. But the interesting thing was that they all went back to England. They all wrote accounts, they attended public meetings, there were huge victory parades, they were treated, so the martyrs became heroes of the working class movement. So if you're an English trade unionist, the importance of the Tolpuddle case is fundamental to the growth of British trade unionism. We don't see it as a fundamental, anything fundamental in Australia as far as trade unionism is concerned, but they saw it as the way in which they were able to knock back the reaction. Now, An interesting thing was George Lovelace was brilliant at publicity, innate publicity, because these were not Captain Swings or Ned Ludd, mythical figures. These were human beings, respected human beings in their communities. These were respected human beings. They had a face, they had a story. When you look at the Palestinian situation, the Gaza situation, people don't have a face, they don't have a story. It's a mass. And that's when we look at the refugee struggles here, you don't get individual stories, because when you humanise your opposition, you create sympathy. But because these were human beings with families, these were disciplined men, these were people who were respected in their community, and these were people who were totally non-violent, because the Methodist principle was, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God. And when George Lovelace was convicted in March 1834 and he was led out in irons, he had written a little song, the Song of Freedom. And I'll try to recite it because I can't sing. And this song became a calling card among the British trade union movement in the reaction, in the mass meetings. Would you know, I know you watch soccer occasionally, you see all those British fans singing. It's not, that comes from political struggle, because soccer wasn't invented, I think, till a bit later, if I remember correctly. But that's singing. You see at cricket today, you see at football matches, rugby league matches, soccer matches. It comes from this trade union ascendancy, belief in people's, in workers' solidarity. Because what we saw is the struggle between middle class liberalism and workers' solidarity. And it's workers' solidarity. So this is the song. I mean, I don't know how, I'll do my best. Here we go. God is our guide. In land, in wave, in plough, in anvil, and in loom, we come to save our community's rights and to speak a tyrant faction's doom. We call on the watchword liberty. We will be free. Can you imagine? This is the first verse. Can you imagine 10,000 people singing this at the top of their voice? Second verse. And this is an important verse. What is it? God is our guide. No swords we draw. We kindle not the battle fires of war. By reason, union, justice, law, we claim our sires' birthrights. We call on liberty's catch. No, we call something catch cry. Liberty. We will be free. All right. Pop song, 1834, 1835. Tens of thousands of people singing it at protests.
When are we going to form a choir and sing it?
You can form a choir and sing it any time you like, but I won't be in the choir. I'm just giving the story. You want to act on it, that's fine. Right, so. A lyricist, yeah, well, yeah. Well, they get back to England, they're hailed as heroes. The trade union movement buys them some land for the free families. Now the tragedy is that when old James Hammett comes back to England, the truth is revealed. Now James Hammett is the hero of the Six, because he wasn't at the meeting on the 9th of December 1833. Although he's a member of the union, the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers, his younger brother Henry, who was 21, a year younger than him, was at the meeting, but his wife was pregnant. So he volunteered to be the 6th member. So That's the way it goes.
Wow.
So they came back, they farmed, and then they got sick and tired. Sick and tired of being trotted out at trade union meetings. Sick and tired of being feted as heroes, and they wanted a quiet life. And in 1847, at the age of 51, George Lovelace and his wife Elizabeth Lovelace and their 3 children, Thomas Stanfield and his son and their children, James Bryan, he married into the Stanfield family, sold the land that had been given them by the trade union movement. James Hammett continued to stay in England. And they went, where did they go? They went back to Australia? No, they went to Upper Canada, Ontario, and they set up a new community at a place called Siloham. And if you ever go to Canada, you should go there, because they built a Methodist church. They led blameless existence, and if you go there today at Siloham, 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 you go there, in the graveyard, in the cemetery, there is the gravestone of George Lovelace and Elizabeth Lovelace, side by side. How's that for a love story?
Do you know what the inscription on the...
I do know it, but I cannot. It's about the Lamb of God and the blood and the sacrifice, but I can't remember it exactly.
Yeah, I was talking about it before.
Yeah.
There's something about going through a lot of trouble.
That's right.
To get there.
Yeah, the Lamb of God. But obviously, I mean, you get to the stage where it just becomes your individual welfare becomes more important than an emerging movement. You just cannot be paraded constantly. So that's why they set up a new life. People didn't know who they were, respected Methodists, set up their own church, set up a farm. End of story. So, what are the parallels? Australia 2024. Let's look at this. It is illegal to strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement, period. We have less rights to withdraw our labour in 2024 than British workers had during the emerging trade union movement. Less rights. It's an extraordinary situation to find yourself in. You can't withdraw your labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement, period. And if you withdraw your labour outside of an enterprise bargaining agreement, period, you can be fined an individual worker $10,000 a day, and it's happened in West Australia. So that worker solidarity, what we've seen over the last 40 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation era, is legislation after legislation being passed to actually criminalise legitimate workplace activity to improve people's situation. At the same time, we've seen the criminalisation of trade union structures. We've seen the dilution of the power of the trade unions and the total amnesia in the public realm regarding the things that people enjoy today as workers. You know, holiday pay, sick pay, long service leave, you get it, overtime pay, occupational safety and health. And today, less than 12% of the Australian workforce is unionised, and most of them are in the public sector. So, in many regards, we don't need a Combination Act. We have a Combination Act. And the dilemma is that that Combination Act has been a byproduct of both major political parties. Because when we deregulated during the Keating-Hawke era, all those gains that had been made in the 60s, the 70s, the 50s, pre-World War II, dissipated. In the 70s, over 55% of workers were in trade unions. But it's been made exceptionally difficult for people to be in trade unions. I don't think you can actually automatically deduct your union fees anymore, can you? No, you can't deduct it. You've got to pay it to the union directly. It can't be deducted from your wage packet, which it used to, which made it easy because it was a weekly contribution. You didn't think of the $600 or $700 you'd have to pay, you know. So there's been a lot of changes, which we've accepted because we've all believed that everything's going to get better, especially if there's a nuclear plant in your backyard. There'll be work for you for eternity.